uh, how can we establish our belief on axiomatic beliefs, which is not rationally proven? I don't know how can you respond to that.
So you're saying, how can you establish your beliefs on axiomatic beliefs? Yeah.
Beliefs which is not rationally proven, and the problem is axioms itself. It's hard to differentiate it with nurture. It's
I don't understand what you mean by differentiating axioms with nurture.
Like
because
socialization.
how can we know this act is axiom or nurture? It's just an hypothesis, so, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. But one would argue that
So how can I
uh,
respond to
it,
that?
it depends in what kind of context you're using axiom. So if you're saying an axiom is a necessary principle or a necessary idea that is required for a particular domain of knowledge to grow, then yeah, those axioms would you would say are necessary for that particular domain of knowledge. For example, in mathematics and certain domains of knowledge in mathematics, you have to assume that the infinity exists. You just have to assume the mathematical infinity. You can't prove it necessarily. You assume it, then you work with it. Now, and one would argue that allows that domain of knowledge in mathematics to actually function and work appropriately. Now, is there anything wrong with that? No. I mean, in every area of knowledge, you have what you call beliefs or ideas or concepts that are true by default, and they are necessary in order for that particular domain of knowledge to actually grow. You even have this in science. You have to have certain unscientific, non-provable from a scientific perspective assumptions in order for science to be science. For example, science has to accept the idea of the causal relation, right? It might not talk about what the reality of that causal relation is, but they have to accept that there are causal relations. That's a metaphysical idea that's still debated in philosophy. So they have to start with that, though, in order for science to work. Imagine you threw causal relations out of the window. It would be very difficult to actually make sense of a lot of science. Another kind of axiomatic belief, if you like, in the scientific domain of knowledge is the fact that they have to argue that nature is uniform. If they don't have that, then any theory, any workable theory that has that's well confirmed from an empirical point of view, any workable theory that has predictive power, that has a lot of confirmations, empirical confirmations, you can never say that theory applies to all the set of particular observations. So for example, take the Darwinian mechanism. They say that the Darwinian mechanism is well confirmed. They say that the Darwinian mechanism has predictive power, and they say the Darwinian mechanism is workable from that perspective. So they say, therefore, the Darwinian mechanism applies as an explanation, as a mechanism to explain all of biological change. But they haven't observed all of biological change. But the only way they can say that, if they have the presupposition or the axiom, if you like, depending how you want to define it, that nature is actually uniform. If they didn't have that assumption, they could never extend any theory. They could never say this well-confirmed theory that has a lot of observations, they can never apply that to the observations they haven't observed yet, which means you could never have any knowledge in science. It will never grow if you never have that assumption. So if your problem is that, how can we have axiomatic beliefs? I don't see that as a problem at all. Obviously, it gets more gray and it gets philosophically messy when you pick specific examples, but as a general principle, to have certain ideas that you will argue to be necessarily true, or ideas that you would argue that you require those particular assumptions or axioms in order for your particular domain of knowledge to grow, that's not particularly problematic, just by virtue of some of the examples I've given you. Now, if you feel that, if you're referring it to the Islamic belief system, then you'll have to give me some examples. But as a general principle, it's well known that you have things like necessary assumptions or first principles or foundational ideas or axioms that are required for domains of knowledge to grow. Does that make sense?
Yeah. For example, the concept of fitra or the first principles, like that. That's what I
Okay.
mean.
Now, what you're doing, you're conflating a first principle. So you're conflating an axiom with a kind of metaphysical first principle. They are slightly different. Metaphysical first principles is what are your first principles that make sense of reality. Okay. So, for example, one of the metaphysical first principles in the philosophy of the mind is that, physicalism is true, which is what? It's the philosophical approach that basically says that consciousness can be reduced to or is identical to in some way to physical processes. So that cannot be proven scientifically because they require that assumption. Yeah, so you can't argue in a circle. Neuroscience requires that assumption. You can't prove that assumption. So they start with that metaphysical first principle, and they say this makes sense of the world of the philosophy of the mind, of the world of consciousness, of the world of the brain. Okay, so it's like a lens that they put on to make sense of reality and to make sense of the observations. Fitra is just like that. It's not an axiom. It's like a metaphysical way of seeing. It's a first principle. It's a lens in which you look at reality and it makes sense of reality. So, for example, the concept of the fitra doesn't go against any scientific data. The concept of the fitra actually makes sense of our intuitions, makes sense of cognitive psychology, makes sense of religion, makes sense of people's needs for spirituality, makes sense for people's adoration for things. It makes sense of all of these things. So it becomes what you call a
But
first
intuition
principle.
is a feeling, isn't it?
Sorry?
But intuition is a feeling, isn't it? It's feelings.
Bro, if you study philosophy, most of philosophy is based on intuition, man. Like, I'll give you an example. I did an analytical module called The Idea of Freedom, and they were discussing, is freedom intrinsic or is it instrumental? And they said, no, it's intrinsically valuable. I asked a stupid question.
Yeah.
I said, well, how do you know? So, well, if it's intrinsic, you don't need to prove it. And I said, okay, how do you ground that? You know what he said? Our intuitions. and a lot of philosophy, if you scratch the surface, the intellectual malarkey, if you scratch the surface and you remove the cobwebs and all that stuff.
Look at, what do you call it? Descartes. I think they're
absolutely. It's like it reduces to sometimes an intuition, and they make sense of that intuition through the philosophical argumentation.
It's actually more. I would argue that it's probably more foundational than anything third person. Yeah, starting with it. If you don't have, I think, therefore I am, which was seen as the bedrock of, or the heart of, like, how to prove your existence using systematic doubt, then you don't have anything actually.
Yeah, I mean, one would argue, I am, therefore I think.
Yeah.
So
but look, the radical skepticism is,
Habibi, don't conflate a feeling with fitra. The idea of the fitra in the Islamic discourse is part of a metaphysic. It's part of a sort of first principles to make sense of reality. Okay, it's not just a feeling. So it makes sense of intuitions, it makes sense of data, it makes sense of the empirical data, it makes sense of anthropology, it makes sense of so many different things. So why would you throw that out of the window? Right? You don't stop. That's not how metaphysics works. And the thing about metaphysics, you don't say, well, can you prove your metaphysics? Well, you haven't understood what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is the starting point. It's the lens. It's like you're blind and the only way you can see is to put your lenses on. You say, well, can you see before you put your lenses on? No, you can't. You have to. Those are your lenses, right? So when people say, oh, prove your metaphysical first principles, well, hold on a second. You just don't understand what metaphysics is. Because if you think that needs proof, then you have an infinite regress of stuff and you don't have any metaphysics. And if you don't have any metaphysics, you don't have anything, because that becomes a bedrock to understand the reality, even the empirical stuff, right? So imagine saying, a physicalist that explains the kind of consciousness and neuroscience is predicated on physicalism, but then they say, can you prove physicalism? Well, if you do that as an infinite regress, you never have any neuroscience that would adequately explain consciousness, because they need that metaphysical first principle. So I think there's a few concepts here that you've basically, I think, maybe jumbled up a bit, Habibi. What this may require is a lighthouse mentoring session, which you can book online. and it's free, 1 hour Zoom session. So I do
Yeah.
advise you to go on that. And that's why, brothers and sisters, Sapience Institute is so important, so we can have these discussions and we can empower our brothers and sisters so they could be able to articulate and share Islam academically, intellectually. And please go to sapienseinstitute.org/donate live in order for you to facilitate these amazing projects, such as the book on doubt that's coming out, such as the course on doubt that's coming out for free, such as the Sapient Thoughts videos, which we've already done 30 episodes, such as the Lighthouse mentoring. We have one-to-one, and we realize the importance of that one-to-one relationship. Articles and essays work to a certain degree, but people need that kind of experiential one-to-one dynamic in order for people to have transformations. Even people with doubts, even ex-Muslims, even non-Muslims that want to know about Islam as well. So may Allah bless every single one of you.